Gideon Flint had tested hundreds of strangers who knocked on his door over the years. Each time he'd pretend to sleep and listen. Each time they revealed their true intentions within an hour. It was a simple rule that had kept him alive on this isolated homestead. Trust no one until you hear what they say when they think you can't hear them. But tonight, something felt different. The two Apache sisters who'd arrived at sunset, claiming to need shelter from the approaching storm, had been whispering for 3 hours straight. 3 hours. No one had ever whispered that long before. Gideon lay perfectly still on his wooden cot, controlling his breathing, listening through the thin cabin wall. The older sister's voice was barely audible, but her words were careful, deliberate. The younger one responded in short, urgent phrases. They weren't speaking English. They weren't speaking any dialect he recognized. But somehow, impossibly, he understood every word. That should have been his first warning that this night would shatter everything he believed about his past. The older sister said something that made his blood turn to ice. She had mentioned a name that no living person should know, a name buried with the ashes of his former life 15 years ago. But when the younger sister responded, Gideon realized with growing horror that they weren't just talking about his past. They were talking about something he'd done, something he'd convinced himself had been forgotten by the world. And as their whispered conversation continued, one terrible truth became clear. These weren't strangers seeking shelter. They had come here specifically for him. The storm had been building all afternoon, but Gideon Flint knew storms. He could read them in the weight of the air, the way his cattle huddled near the eastern fence, the color of the clouds rolling across the prairie. This one would last through the night. When the two Apache women appeared at his door just as the first drops began to fall, something in his chest tightened. The older one stood tall despite the exhaustion in her dark eyes, while the younger sister leaned heavily against the porch post, favoring her left leg. Both wore travel-worn dresses that had seen better days, and their long black hair hung loose around their shoulders. "Please," the older woman said, her English careful but clear. "My sister needs shelter, just for the night." Gideon's hand remained on the door frame, blocking their entry. In 15 years on this homestead, he'd learned to trust his instincts. Something about these two felt different, too deliberate, too convenient. "There's a town 12 miles south," he said, watching their reactions carefully. "They've got a proper inn." The younger sister looked up then, and Gideon saw something that made him pause. Pain, yes, but also a flicker of recognition in her eyes, as if she'd seen him before. That was impossible. He would have remembered. "The storm," the older woman pressed. "We cannot travel in this weather. My sister was injured yesterday. Please." Lightning split the sky behind them, and the rain began in earnest. Gideon's practical side warred with years of hard-earned caution. But when he looked at the younger sister again, something in her expression reminded him of someone he'd tried very hard to forget. Against his better judgment, he stepped aside. "You can sleep by the fire," he said, gesturing toward the small common room. "But I rise before dawn. You'll need to be gone by then." "Of course," the older woman replied. But there was something in her tone that suggested she had no intention of leaving so soon. As they settled near the fireplace, Gideon retreated to his cot in the back room, separated from them by only a thin wooden wall. He lay down fully clothed, keeping his boots on. This was his test. In an hour, maybe 2, they would reveal their true purpose. They always did. But as he closed his eyes and slowed his breathing to mimic sleep, Gideon couldn't shake the feeling that tonight he might be the one being tested. The younger sister whispered something in Apache, and her words hit him like a physical blow, because somehow, impossibly, he understood every word. "Sister," she had said, "we found him." Gideon's heart hammered against his ribs, but he forced himself to remain perfectly still. The Apache words came flooding back to him now, pulled from a part of his memory he'd sealed shut 15 years ago. He'd spent 3 years living among the Apache after his family died, learning their language, their ways, their customs, before everything went wrong, before he became someone else entirely. The older sister responded in low, urgent tones. "Ayanna, be quiet. If he understands our words, he's asleep, Kaya. Look at his breathing." But Gideon wasn't asleep. Every muscle in his body was coiled tight as he listened to them discuss him in the language he'd once spoken fluently, the language he'd sworn never to use again. 15 winters have passed, Ayanna continued. "He looks older, harder. The scar is still there," Kaya whispered. "Above his left eye. It's him." Gideon's hand instinctively moved toward the thin white line that cut through his eyebrow, a reminder of the day his old life ended. Very few people knew about that scar. Even fewer were still alive who'd seen how he got it. What if he doesn't remember us? Kaya asked. He remembers, Ayana replied with certainty. The question is whether he'll listen, and if he refuses, then we take what we came for and leave. But sister, if what grandmother told us is true, if he really was the one who— Her voice dropped so low that Gideon had to strain to hear. If he was the one who saved our brother that day, then he deserves to know the truth about what happened after. Gideon's breath caught in his throat. Their brother. He remembered now, a young Apache boy, maybe 8 years old, caught in a flash flood. Gideon had pulled him from the rushing water, carried him to safety. But that was years before he left the Apache lands. Years before the incident that forced him to disappear. The truth will destroy him, Kaya said softly. Perhaps, but the lie has already destroyed someone else. The sisters fell silent then, and Gideon found himself trapped between desperate curiosity and growing dread. What truth? What lie? And why had they tracked him down after all these years? Thunder rolled across the prairie, and rain drummed harder against the cabin roof. In the sudden quiet between them, Gideon heard something that chilled him to the bone. One of the sisters was crying, but it wasn't tears of sadness. It was the sound of someone who'd been carrying a terrible burden for far too long. Someone who'd finally found the person who might be able to help them set it down. Tomorrow, Ayana whispered. When the storm ends, we tell him everything. What if he runs? Then we follow him. We've waited too long for this. Our brother deserves justice, even if it comes 15 years too late. The word justice hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Gideon lay frozen on his cot, his mind racing backward through 15 years of carefully buried memories. Their brother, the boy from the flood. But what did justice have to do with a rescue? Unless— I still see his face in my dreams, Kaya whispered, and her voice was thick with old grief. Little Dakota, so proud when he learned to track deer with the older boys, so excited to prove himself. Dakota. The name hit Gideon like a fist to the stomach. He remembered now, not just the rescue, but what came after. The boy who'd grown into a young man. The young man who'd been there that terrible day when everything went wrong. Tell me again what the traitor said, Ayana murmured. That there was a witness, someone who saw what really happened at the canyon. Someone who could prove that Dakota didn't start the fight that got him killed. Gideon's throat constricted. The canyon. The fight. The day that had haunted his nightmares for 15 years. The day he'd been forced to choose between staying to tell the truth and running to save his own life. The traitor said this man, this Gideon Flint, was there when our brother died. That he knows who really fired the first shot. But why didn't he come forward? Why didn't he speak for Dakota when the soldiers came asking questions? Maybe he was afraid. Maybe he thought no one would believe him. Or maybe— Kaya's voice turned hard— he was the one who killed our brother. The accusation struck Gideon like lightning. They thought he was the killer. They'd tracked him down because they believed he'd murdered Dakota. The irony was suffocating. They wanted justice for their brother's death, but they'd found the one man who'd tried desperately to prevent it. We have to be careful, Ayana warned. If he is guilty, if he knows we suspect him, then why would he let us stay? Why give us shelter? Perhaps he feels guilty. Or perhaps he wants to know what we know before he decides what to do with us. Gideon's hands clenched into fists beneath his blanket. The terrible weight of that day came flooding back. The argument between Dakota and the group of drifters, the insults that escalated into threats, the moment when Gideon saw one of the drifters reach for his gun. He'd shouted a warning, but it came too late. By the time the smoke cleared, young Dakota lay bleeding in the dirt, and the drifters were claiming self-defense. But only Gideon had seen the truth. Only he knew that Dakota never drew his weapon. Tomorrow we ask him directly, Ayana decided. We tell him we know he was there. We demand the truth. And if he lies, then we make him understand that some debts must be paid. No matter how much time has passed. The sisters fell quiet, but Gideon could hear them moving about, preparing for sleep. His mind churned with the weight of what he'd learned. They weren't here to thank him for saving their brother as a boy. They were here because they thought he'd killed that same brother as a man. The storm was beginning to weaken, but inside the cabin, a different kind of tempest was building. And tomorrow, when the truth finally came out, Gideon wasn't sure any of them would survive it. Sleep was impossible. Gideon lay listening to the gradual quieting of the storm and the soft breathing of the two women in the next room. Every detail of that day 15 years ago played in his mind with cruel clarity. He'd been trading horses with a group of Apache families when the trouble started. Dakota, now 19 and eager to prove himself as a warrior, had ridden into their camp with news that a group of drifters was stealing cattle from Apache lands. The boy had wanted to confront them alone, but Gideon had insisted on coming along. They'd found the drifters at Silver Canyon, 5 rough men driving a small herd of stolen cattle. What should have been a simple confrontation had turned ugly fast. The leader, a scarred man named Dutch Morrison, had laughed when Dakota demanded they return the animals. "Indian boy thinks he can tell white men what to do," Morrison had sneered. Dakota's hand had moved to his knife, but he hadn't drawn it. Gideon remembered that clearly. The young man had kept his weapons sheathed, trying to solve the problem with words first, just as his grandfather had taught him. But Morrison and his men had no interest in words. Gideon had seen Morrison's hand inch toward his pistol and had opened his mouth to shout a warning. In that split second before the gunshot rang out, their eyes had met. Morrison had smiled, and Gideon knew the man was about to commit murder. The shot came fast, too fast for Dakota to react. The young Apache fell without ever drawing a weapon. When the soldiers arrived to investigate, Morrison claimed self-defense, said the savage had attacked them first, that they'd fired to protect themselves. The other drifters backed his story. 5 white men against 1 Apache witness, who wasn't even family. The investigation barely lasted an hour, but there had been another witness. Gideon had seen everything from behind a rock outcropping where he'd been watching the cattle. Morrison knew he was there. After the soldiers left, the drifter had found him. "You seem like a smart man," Morrison had said, his gun still smoking in his hand. "Smart enough to know that sometimes the truth ain't worth dying for." The threat was clear. Stay silent or join Dakota in the ground. Gideon had made his choice. He'd taken Morrison's money, left Apache lands that very night and never spoken Dakota's name again. For 15 years, he'd told himself he'd had no choice. 5 armed men against 1. He would have died for nothing. But lying here now, listening to the quiet grief of Dakota's sisters, Gideon finally understood the true cost of his cowardice. Outside, the storm was breaking apart, but inside his chest, a different kind of weather was building. The sisters wanted justice for their brother. They deserved the truth. But the truth wouldn't just destroy Morrison. It would destroy Gideon too. Because there was one detail he'd never told anyone. One secret that made his silence even more damning. Morrison hadn't just threatened him. The drifter had offered him a partnership. A cut of every herd they stole. Every job they pulled. Easy money for keeping quiet about what he'd seen. And in his fear and desperation, Gideon had said yes. As dawn approached and he heard the sisters beginning to stir, Gideon realized his test had failed completely. He'd learned their plan, but in doing so, he'd discovered something far worse. The man they'd come to find wasn't just a coward who'd watched their brother die. He was an accomplice to murder. Dawn crept through the small window, painting the cabin walls in shades of gray. Gideon heard the sisters moving about quietly, whispering as they prepared for what they clearly believed would be a confrontation. He could no longer bear the weight of pretending to sleep. Slowly, he sat up on his cot and faced the truth he'd been running from for 15 years. "I know you're awake," came Ayana's voice from the next room, steady and sure. "We heard your breathing change an hour ago." Gideon's blood went cold. They'd known he was listening. The entire conversation had been deliberate, designed to test him just as he'd tried to test them. The hunters had become the hunted. He stood and walked into the main room where both sisters waited by the dying fire. In the pale morning light, he could see their father's features in their high cheekbones, their grandmother's wisdom in their dark eyes. These weren't the frightened travelers they'd pretended to be. These were warriors on a mission. "How long have you known?" he asked quietly. "That you were listening?" "Since the moment you lay down," Kaya replied. "Men who truly sleep don't hold their breath when thunder strikes." "That's not what I meant." "We know." Ayana stepped forward, and Gideon saw her hand rest near the knife at her belt. "The question is, what are you going to do about it?" For a long moment, the three of them stared at each other across the small room. Outside, morning birds were beginning to sing, but inside the cabin, the air felt heavy with the weight of unspoken truths. "I didn't kill your brother," Gideon said finally. "But you know who did." Kaya accused. Yes. And you said nothing. For 15 years you let his killer walk free. Gideon's hands trembled as the full scope of his guilt settled on him like a physical weight. It wasn't that simple. It was exactly that simple. Ayana's voice cut like a blade. A man murdered our brother in cold blood. You watched it happen. You chose to stay silent. I chose to stay alive. You chose money over justice. The words hit him like a physical blow. They knew about Morrison's payment. Somehow they knew everything. How? He whispered. Dutch Morrison got drunk in a trading post 3 years ago, Kaya said, her voice bitter with old pain. Started bragging about how he'd bought himself a witness to murder. How some coward named Gideon Flint took his silver in exchange for letting him walk free after killing an Apache. The room spun around Gideon. Morrison was still alive, still telling the story, still destroying lives with his poison. And now these women knew the full extent of his betrayal. Where is he? Ayana demanded. I don't know. I never saw him again after that day. Liar. I swear to you, You took money from our brother's killer, Kaya interrupted. Stepping closer. Blood money. You became his partner in murder the moment you accepted his payment. Gideon wanted to deny it, wanted to explain the fear and desperation that had driven his choice. But looking into their faces, seeing the pain he'd helped cause, he found he had no words left for excuses. What do you want from me? He asked instead. The sisters exchanged a look, and Gideon saw something in their eyes that made his stomach drop. We want you to help us find him, Ayana said quietly. And then we want you to watch him die. Gideon stared at the two women, his mind reeling from their demand. Help them find Morrison. Watch him die. After 15 years of running from his past, they wanted him to run straight toward it. You're asking me to help you commit murder. We're asking you to help us deliver justice, Ayana corrected. There's a difference. Not in the eyes of the law. The law had its chance 15 years ago, Kaya said bitterly. The law chose to believe 5 white men over the truth. The law failed our brother. Gideon understood their anger, felt it burning in his own chest. But what they were proposing would make them no better than Morrison himself. And if I refuse, then you'll spend the rest of your life looking over your shoulder, Ayana said simply. Because we'll tell everyone who you really are. Every town, every territory. The man who took blood money to cover up murder. The threat was clear. His carefully built new life would crumble within months. No one would trade with him, sell to him, or offer him work. He'd become a pariah, forced to keep running until he died alone and forgotten. How did you find me? He asked, stalling for time to think. It took 3 years, Kaya admitted. We followed Morrison's trail from trading post to saloon, listening to his drunken stories. He mentioned your name often, always laughing about his business partner who helped him get away with murder. I wasn't his partner. You took his money. You kept his secret. You let him profit from our brother's death. Ayana's voice was cold as winter wind. What would you call it? The words hit home because they were true. For 15 years, Gideon had told himself he'd been a victim of circumstance, that he'd had no choice. But sitting here now, facing the consequences of his cowardice, he couldn't maintain the lie any longer. Morrison spoke about you like you were friends, Kaya continued. Said you'd been reliable, kept your word. Said he knew where to find you if he ever needed a favor. A chill ran down Gideon's spine. He knows where I am? For years, apparently. He's been keeping track of you, making sure his investment stayed quiet. The implications crashed over Gideon like a wave. Morrison had been watching him, monitoring his life, ready to eliminate him if he ever became a threat. All these years, Gideon had thought he was hiding, but he'd really been a prisoner. There's something else, Ayana said, and her voice carried a note that made Gideon's stomach clench. Morrison isn't just a cattle thief anymore. He's built himself a small empire. Dozens of men work for him now, stealing livestock, robbing supply wagons, murdering anyone who gets in their way. How many people has he killed since Dakota? Kaya asked quietly. The question hung in the air like smoke. How many deaths was Gideon responsible for? How many families had Morrison destroyed while living free because of his silence? We tracked down some of the other drifters who were there that day, Ayana continued. 2 of them are dead. 1 disappeared. But the 4th one, he told us something interesting before we convinced him to talk. What? Morrison has been planning something big, a robbery that will set him up for life. And he wants his old partner to help him pull it off. Gideon felt the blood drain from his face. What are you talking about? He's coming here, Gideon. Tomorrow, maybe the day after. He's coming to collect his business partner for one final job. The room seemed to tilt around him. Morrison here. After 15 years of carefully maintained distance, the killer was coming to drag him back into the darkness. That's why we had to find you first, Kaya said softly. Because when Morrison arrives, you're going to have to choose. Choose what? Whether you die as his partner, Ayanna said, or live as our ally. The sound of approaching horses reached them before noon. 3 riders, moving at an unhurried pace across the prairie toward Gideon's homestead. Through the window, he could see them clearly. Dutch Morrison in the lead, flanked by 2 younger men with the hard eyes of professional killers. Get in the back room, Gideon told the sisters urgently. Stay quiet no matter what you hear. No, Ayanna said firmly. We've waited 15 years for this moment. This isn't how it should happen. Not like this. Then how? Kaya demanded. When Morrison rides away from here, how many more people will die because we let him go? Before Gideon could answer, Morrison's voice boomed across the yard. Gideon Flint, get yourself out here, partner. We've got business to discuss. The word partner hit Gideon like a physical blow. Even after all these years, Morrison still considered him an ally, still expected his cooperation. The presumption was sickening. Stay hidden, he whispered to the sisters, then stepped outside onto the porch. Morrison looked older, but no less dangerous. His hair had gone gray at the temples, and new scars marked his weathered face. But his eyes held the same cold calculation that had terrified Gideon 15 years ago. Well, well, Morrison said, dismounting from his horse. You've done well for yourself out here. Nice quiet place to lay low. What do you want, Dutch? What I want is my old partner back. I've got a job that needs doing, and I need someone I can trust. Morrison's smile was all teeth and no warmth. Someone who knows how to keep his mouth shut. I'm not your partner. I never was. Now that's not how I remember it. Morrison stepped closer, his hand resting casually on his gun butt. I remember you taking my money real eager-like. I remember you disappearing that very night without a word to nobody. That's partnership behavior, Gideon. That was fear, not partnership. Call it what you want. Point is, you've been living free all these years because of our arrangement. Time to pay some of that debt back. Through the window, Gideon caught a glimpse of movement. The sisters were positioning themselves, preparing for whatever came next. His heart raced as he realized the explosive situation building around him. What kind of job? He asked, stalling. Supply wagon heading through Devil's Canyon next week. Army payroll. Enough silver to set us all up for life. But it's a tricky job. Needs careful planning. Needs someone the soldiers might trust. Morrison's eyes glittered with greed. Someone with a respectable reputation. And if I refuse? Morrison's expression darkened. You know too much about my business to refuse, partner. Always have. That's why I kept track of you all these years. Insurance, you might call it. The threat was clear. Cooperate or die. But before Gideon could respond, a new voice cut through the tension like a blade. Dutch Morrison. All 3 men spun toward the cabin. Ayanna stood in the doorway, her rifle trained on Morrison's chest. Behind her, Kaya emerged with a pistol in each hand. Morrison's face went white as he recognized them. No, he breathed. It can't be. Hello, Uncle, Ayanna said, her voice steady as stone. We've been looking for you. The recognition in Morrison's eyes confirmed what Gideon had just learned. These weren't just Dakota's sisters. They were Morrison's nieces. The man had murdered his own family. You killed our brother, Kaya said, her voice trembling with 15 years of suppressed rage. Your own nephew. Dakota was getting too bold, Morrison replied, his shock giving way to defensive anger. Always stirring up trouble with the other tribes, making it harder for everyone to do business. He would have gotten us all killed. He was trying to protect our people from thieves like you. I was trying to survive. Morrison's hand moved toward his gun, but stopped when he saw both sisters tighten their grips on their weapons. You think I wanted it to happen? He was family. Family doesn't steal from family, Ayanna said coldly. Family doesn't murder family for profit. Morrison's men were reaching for their weapons when Gideon made his choice. After 15 years of cowardice, of running from the truth, he finally found his courage. Dutch Morrison murdered Dakota in cold blood, he said loudly, his voice carrying across the yard. The boy never drew his weapon, never threatened anyone. Morrison shot him down like a dog and paid me to keep quiet about it. Shut your mouth, Flint. I watched him die, Gideon continued, stepping between Morrison and the sisters. "I watched you kill an unarmed boy and I said nothing. But I'm saying something now." Morrison's face twisted with rage. "You broke our deal. There was never any deal. There was just a coward too afraid to speak the truth." Morrison went for his gun, but Gideon was ready. He tackled the older man around the waist, driving him backward into the dirt. They rolled and struggled, fighting for control of Morrison's weapon. The two gunmen tried to help their boss, but found themselves facing the sisters' steady aim. Smart enough to recognize a losing position, they raised their hands in surrender. Morrison broke free and scrambled to his feet, his gun finally clear of its holster. But as he raised it toward Gideon, Ayanna's rifle spoke first. The shot echoed across the prairie, and Dutch Morrison crumpled to the ground. He tried to speak, blood frothing from his lips, but only managed a wet gurgle before his eyes went dark. For a long moment, the four survivors stood in the sudden quiet, staring down at the body of the man who had poisoned so many lives. "It's finished," Kaya said softly. Gideon looked at the sisters. These remarkable women who had tracked him down not for revenge, but for justice. "What happens now?" "Now you live with the truth instead of running from it," Ayanna replied. "And maybe that's enough." They buried Morrison in an unmarked grave behind the cabin. His men rode away, eager to distance themselves from their dead leader's crimes. And as the sun set over the prairie, Gideon finally felt the weight of 15 years lifting from his shoulders. The sisters stayed 3 more days, helping him set his affairs in order. When they finally left, Gideon gave them Morrison's remaining money, blood money that would help rebuild what the killer had destroyed. He never saw them again, but he never forgot them either, and for the first time in 15 years, Gideon Flint slept peacefully through the night. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable Western tale, where courage and redemption collide in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us. She was too old for marriage, too weathered, too used up by life to expect tenderness from anyone. That's what they told her in the general store, what they whispered behind gloved hands at church, what they confirmed with every pitying glance thrown her way. Marisol Crane had heard it so many times she'd almost started to believe it herself. But on the morning she found blood on her porch, everything she thought she knew about herself, about loneliness, about the limits of her own heart, was about to shatter. Because the man who left that trail of crimson across her wooden boards wasn't from her world at all. And what he would awaken in her couldn't be measured by the cruel mathematics of age or expectation. Marisol stood at the edge of her property, staring at the dark stains that led from the fence line to her front steps. The sun had barely cleared the horizon, painting the grasslands in shades of copper and gold. Her hands, roughened by decades of ranch work, gripped the water pail she'd been carrying. She should have been afraid. A sensible woman would have fetched the rifle from inside, maybe ridden into town for help. But Marisol had stopped being sensible the day she turned 40 and realized no one was coming to save her from the slow death of invisibility. She followed the trail. Each drop told a story of desperation, of someone moving despite pain that should have stopped them. The marks led around the side of her house, past the chicken coop where the birds clucked nervously, and ended at the small storage shed she used for tools and grain. The door hung slightly open. Marisol approached slowly, her heartbeat loud in her ears. Through the gap, she could see him, a young man, collapsed against bags of feed, his breathing shallow and labored. His chest was bare, marked with geometric patterns she recognized from the tribal peoples who sometimes traded in the distant parts of the territory. Blood seeped from a deep gash along his ribs. His eyes were closed, dark hair falling across a face that couldn't have seen more than 28 summers. She should have left him. That's what the town would expect. What Cordelia Vance and her circle of righteous judgment would demand. But as Marisol looked at him, something ancient and buried stirred in her chest. Not pity, not even compassion. Something more dangerous. The recognition that another living soul was suffering, and she had the power to ease that suffering. She knelt beside him, and his eyes opened. Dark, feverish, but startlingly clear. He tried to speak, but only managed a word in a language she didn't understand. His hand moved slightly, palm up, a gesture that seemed both defensive and pleading. "I'm not going to hurt you," Marisol said softly. "Let me help." He watched her for a long moment, as if measuring the truth of her words. Then, almost imperceptibly, he nodded. Marisol worked quickly, tearing strips from her apron to bind the wound temporarily. His skin was warm beneath her fingers, fever hot, but alive. When had she last touched another person with anything resembling tenderness? She couldn't remember. The realization made her hands tremble slightly. "Can you walk?" she asked. "I need to get you inside. Clean this properly." He nodded again, and with her help, managed to stand. He was taller than she'd realized, and despite his injury, there was a quiet strength in the way he moved. They made slow progress to the house, his weight heavy against her shoulder. Marisol's mind raced ahead. She had supplies, knowledge of wounds from years of tending livestock. She could help him. But if anyone from town found out she was harboring him, particularly him, a young tribal warrior, alone in her house, the thought should have stopped her at the door. Instead, it made her push it open wider. Inside, she helped him to the narrow bed in the back room. The one she'd kept made up for visitors who never came. He collapsed onto it with a grunt of pain. Marisol fetched her medicine box, water, clean cloth. As she worked, cleaning the wound with steady hands, she felt his eyes on her, watching, studying her with an intensity that made her acutely aware of her graying hair, her lined face, the dry skin on her hands. "What's your name?" she asked, more to break the silence than anything else. "Dakota," he said, his voice rough but surprisingly deep. His English was accented but clear. "I'm Marisol." She pressed the cloth against his ribs, and he flinched, but didn't pull away. "What happened to you?" He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "I was tracking something. Got separated from my brothers. There was trouble." She wanted to ask more, but the wound needed her attention. As she worked, she became aware of how close they were, how the room seemed to shrink around them. The air felt charged with something she didn't want to name. When she finished binding his ribs properly, she sat back. "You should rest. Fever's setting in." "Why are you helping me?" Dakota asked. His eyes hadn't left her face. It was a fair question. Marisol considered lying, giving him some noble reason. But there was something about his direct gaze that demanded honesty. "Because I know what it's like," she said quietly, "to bleed where no one can see." Something shifted in his expression. Understanding, maybe, or recognition. Before he could respond, exhaustion claimed him, his eyes closing as fever pulled him under. Marisol sat there for a long moment, watching him breathe. Outside, she could hear the normal sounds of her ranch, the horses in the corral, the wind moving through dry grass, everything exactly as it had been yesterday, and the day before, and the day before that. But inside this room, inside her own chest, something fundamental had changed. She just didn't know yet what it would cost her. What she also didn't know was that at that very moment, Cordelia Vance's youngest son was riding past her property, close enough to see the blood trail, close enough to wonder, and certainly close enough to talk. The news reached town before sunset. Marisol didn't know this yet as she sat beside Dakota's bed, changing the dressing on his wound. His fever had worsened through the afternoon, leaving him restless and murmuring words she couldn't understand. She dipped a cloth in cool water and pressed it to his forehead, a gesture so intimate it made her hand hesitate before touching his skin. His eyes opened, clearer than before despite the fever. "You should not do this," he said, his voice rough. "Your people will not understand." "My people stopped understanding me a long time ago," Marisol replied, wringing out the cloth. "Drink this." She held a cup of water mixed with willow bark to his lips. He drank, then caught her wrist gently as she pulled the cup away. His fingers were warm against her pulse point. "Why do they call you that word? The one I heard in town once. Spinster." Marisol felt heat rise to her face. "You've been to our town?" "Once. Trading with my brothers. I heard women talking about someone. They laughed, said she was too old, too difficult, that no man would want her." His thumb moved slightly against her wrist. Whether conscious or not, she couldn't tell. "I think they meant you." She should have pulled away, should have felt shame. Instead, something defiant sparked in her chest. "Yes, they meant me. That's what they call women who never married, who are past the age when anyone expects them to be chosen." "Chosen," he said the word like it tasted wrong. "Where I come from, a woman of your seasons would be honored. You have survived. You have learned. You have strength." His eyes held hers. "These are not small things." The words landed somewhere deep in Marisol's chest, in a place that had been hollow so long she'd forgotten it existed. She pulled her hand away gently, needing distance. You need to rest. That fever needs to break. But even as she stood, she felt the weight of his gaze following her. And for the first time in decades, being watched didn't feel like judgment. She was checking the horses in the corral when she heard the wagon. Cordelia Vance arrived like a storm wrapped in expensive fabric, her face tight with righteous concern. 2 other women from town flanked her, their expressions a mirror of scandalized curiosity. "Marisol Crane," Cordelia called out before even climbing down. "We need to speak with you. Now." Marisol's stomach tightened, but she kept her voice level. "About what, Cordelia? About what you're hiding in that house." Cordelia finally descended, her boots hitting the dirt with authority. "My son rode past here this morning, saw blood, a trail leading to your door. And I know the tribal peoples have been moving through this territory." The other women whispered to each other, eyes darting to Marisol's house. "I found an injured man," Marisol said carefully. "I'm helping him. That's all." "That's all?" Cordelia's voice rose. "An unmarried woman alone, harboring a young tribal warrior in her home? Do you understand how this looks? What people will say? People already say plenty about me." "Cordelia, this won't be new. But this is different." Cordelia stepped closer, her voice dropping to something almost gentle, which was somehow more dangerous. "This isn't just gossip about your age or your unmarried state. This is about propriety, about what's acceptable. You're making yourself a spectacle. You're making all of us look bad." "I'm caring for someone who's hurt," Marisol said, her voice harder now. "When did that become shameful? When you're a woman alone with a young man who isn't your kin. When you're—" Cordelia paused, choosing her words carefully. "When you're at an age where such attentions look desperate." The words hit exactly where Cordelia intended. Marisol felt them land, felt the old shame trying to rise. But behind her, through the window, she could sense Dakota's presence in her home, could still feel the ghost of his thumb against her wrist, could still hear him say, "You have survived. You have learned. You have strength. He'll be gone when he's healed," Marisol said quietly. "Until then, I'm not turning him out to die. If that makes me a spectacle, so be it." Cordelia's expression hardened. "You're making a mistake, the kind that follows a woman forever." She turned back to her wagon, the other women scrambling after her. "Don't say I didn't warn you." As they drove away, Marisol stood in her yard, feeling the weight of what had just begun. Inside her house, a young man lay fevered and vulnerable. In town, tongues were already wagging. And somewhere between those two truths, Marisol felt something she hadn't felt in years, the terrifying possibility that her life might actually change. She just didn't know yet that Cordelia had already decided Marisol's reputation wasn't the only thing that needed to be destroyed. That night, Dakota's fever broke. Marisol woke to the sound of him moving in the back room, and when she entered with a lamp, she found him sitting up, weak but lucid. The wound was healing cleanly, the angry red fading to pink at the edges. She should have felt relief. Instead, she felt something closer to dread, because a man who was healing was a man who would leave. "You look better," she said, setting the lamp on the small table beside the bed. "I feel like I was trampled," he replied, but there was a hint of humor in his voice. "But alive, thanks to you." Marisol busied herself checking his bandages, needing something to do with her hands. In the lamplight, she was acutely aware of how close they were, of the warmth radiating from his skin. His chest was bare except for the wrapping, and she tried not to notice the way shadows played across the planes of his shoulders. "The women who came today," Dakota said quietly. "They were angry. They were concerned about propriety," Marisol corrected, though the words felt hollow. "They were afraid," he countered. "Afraid of what you're doing, of what it means." "And what does it mean?" The question escaped before she could stop it. Dakota was quiet for a moment, his dark eyes studying her face. "It means you see me as a person, not as something to fear or use. It means you have courage they don't understand." He paused. "And it means you're lonely as I've been since my wife died." Marisol's hands stilled on the bandage. "You were married?" 3 winters ago. Sickness took her and our child both." His voice remained steady, but something in his eyes dimmed. "I left my village because everywhere I looked, I saw them. I've been wandering since, looking for, I don't know, peace maybe." The honesty in his words struck something deep. Marisol sat on the edge of the bed, propriety forgotten. I'm sorry. That kind of loss, it changes you. Yes, it makes you realize that time is not promised. That waiting for the right moment means you might wait forever. His hand moved, covering hers where it rested on his bandage. Why did you never marry? The question should have felt invasive. Instead, it felt like relief. Like someone had finally asked the thing everyone wondered but never voiced. Because no one ever asked, she said simply. When I was young, I was too poor. My father lost everything. And men don't marry women who come with debt. By the time I'd built this place up, made it profitable, I was already past 30. Past the age when men look at women and see possibility. She tried to pull her hand away, but he held it gently. Now I'm past 50. I'm the cautionary tale mothers tell their daughters. The woman who waited too long and ended up alone. You're not alone right now, Dakota said softly. The air between them shifted, charged with something Marisol didn't dare name. His thumb traced a slow circle on the back of her hand, and she felt it in her entire body. When had anyone touched her with such deliberate tenderness? This is foolish, she whispered, but didn't move away. You're young enough to be my son. I'm old enough to know what I feel, he replied. And I feel seen when you look at me. Not measured, not judged, just seen. He lifted her hand slowly, his eyes never leaving hers, and pressed her palm against his chest. His heart beat strong and steady beneath her fingers. Does that feel like a child to you? Marisol's breath caught. Every rational thought screamed that this was wrong, impossible, destined for disaster. But her body remembered what her mind had tried to forget. The ache of wanting, the hunger for connection, the desperate human need to be touched as if you mattered. Before she could respond, voices erupted outside. Angry voices. Men's voices. Torchlight flickered through the window, casting moving shadows across the walls. Dakota was on his feet instantly despite his injury, moving to the window. There are 8 of them, maybe more. Marisol's blood turned cold. She recognized Cordelia's husband's voice among them, and others from town. Men who'd ignored her for years now gathered in her yard like she was suddenly worth their attention. Marisol Crane! The voice belonged to Vernon Gast, the town's self-appointed moral authority. We know you've got that savage in there. Send him out or we're coming in. Dakota turned to her, his expression grave. I need to go. If I stay, they'll destroy you. If you go, they'll destroy you, Marisol countered, her mind racing. She'd never seen men from town organized like this, with such speed and purpose. This wasn't concern. This was something uglier, something that had been waiting for an excuse. Let me talk to them, she said, moving toward the door. Dakota caught her arm. Don't go out there alone. I've been alone for 52 years, Marisol said, and she meant it in ways that went far deeper than the immediate danger. I know how to handle being alone. But as she walked toward her front door, toward the angry men in her yard, she realized for the first time in decades, she didn't want to be alone anymore. And that was the most dangerous thing of all. Marisol stepped onto her porch, and the night air hit her face like a slap. 8 men stood in her yard, torches casting their faces in harsh orange light. Vernon Gast stood at the front, his expression a mixture of righteousness and something uglier. Behind him she recognized Samuel Cordell, the blacksmith, and others she'd seen in town for years, men who'd never once acknowledged her existence until now. This is my property, Marisol said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. You have no right to be here. We have every right when you're harboring a dangerous man, Vernon replied. That warrior could be a scout, could be planning something against the town. You're putting all of us at risk. He's injured and recovering. Nothing more. That's not what Cordelia says. Samuel stepped forward, his massive frame blocking the torchlight. She says you've been alone with him, day and night. A young man, Marisol. In your house. In your bed, maybe. The implication hung in the air like smoke. Marisol felt heat rise to her face, not from shame, but from rage. What happens in my house is my concern. Not when it affects the town's reputation, Vernon countered. Not when it makes decent people uncomfortable. You're a single woman, Marisol, past the age of propriety. What you're doing, it's unseemly. Desperate. There it was. The word that cut deeper than any blade. Desperate. The ultimate condemnation of a woman who'd outlived her usefulness in society's eyes. I want him gone, Vernon continued. Tonight. If you won't send him out, we'll come in and get him. You'll have to go through me first. The voice came from behind her. Dakota stood in the doorway. one hand pressed against his bandaged ribs, but his posture straight and unyielding. He'd pulled on his shirt despite the pain it must have caused. In the torchlight, he looked every inch the warrior these men feared. "This doesn't concern you, savage," Samuel growled. "It concerns me when 8 men threaten a woman who showed mercy." Dakota's English was clear, each word deliberate. "Where I come from, we honor those who help the wounded. We don't punish them." "You're not where you come from," Vernon said. "You're on our land now, and you'll follow our rules." "Whose rules?" Marisol demanded, finding her voice again. "The rules that say I'm too old to matter? Too unmarried to have value? The rules that let you ignore me for decades until I do something that offends your sensibilities?" She descended the porch steps, moving closer to the men. "I've lived by your rules my entire life. Kept quiet, stayed invisible, built this ranch with my own hands while you barely noticed I existed. And now, because I've chosen to help someone, you think you can storm my property and make demands?" "We're trying to protect you," Vernon said, but his voice had lost some of its certainty. "From what? From being seen as something other than a dried-up spinster? From finally being treated as if I still have worth?" Marisol's hands clenched at her sides. "He sees me, Vernon. In 3 days, that man has shown me more respect than this entire town has in 50 years. That's exactly the problem," a new voice called out. Cordelia emerged from behind the group, her face triumphant. "You're so starved for attention that you'll take it from anyone, even someone inappropriate, even someone who makes you look pathetic." The word landed like a physical blow. Marisol felt Dakota tense behind her, felt him move forward to defend her, but she held up a hand to stop him, because something inside her had finally broken free of the chains she'd worn for so long. "You want to know what's pathetic, Cordelia?" Marisol's voice was quiet but carried across the yard. "Living your entire life terrified of what others think, measuring every word, every action, every breath by whether it meets someone else's approval. I've done that. For 52 years, I've twisted myself into whatever shape would make me acceptable. And you know what I got for it? Nothing. Absolutely nothing." She turned, looking up at Dakota on the porch. His eyes met hers, and in them she saw something she'd been too afraid to name before. Not pity, not gratitude, something warmer, something that made her next words easier than they should have been. "So yes, I'm helping him, and when he's healed, if he chooses to stay, I'll welcome him. And if that makes me pathetic in your eyes, Cordelia, then I'll wear that label proudly, because it's the first honest thing I've done in decades." The silence that followed was deafening. Vernon and the others looked uncertain now, their righteous purpose faltering in the face of Marisol's defiance. But Cordelia's expression had hardened into something cold and calculating. "Then you've made your choice," Cordelia said softly. "And you'll live with the consequences. All of them." The men backed away slowly, torches retreating into the darkness. But as they left, Marisol heard the whispers, heard the words that would follow her now. Shameless, desperate, foolish. Words that would spread through town like wildfire. When they were gone, Marisol's legs nearly gave out. Dakota was there instantly, his arm around her waist, supporting her. The touch sent heat through her entire body despite the cooling night air. "You shouldn't have done that," he said quietly. "They'll make your life difficult now." "They already did," Marisol replied. "At least now I'll have something real to show for it." She looked up at him, and in the moonlight she saw him clearly. Not as a patient, not as an obligation, but as a man who'd awakened something in her she'd thought long dead. And the terrifying part was that she could see in his eyes that he felt it too. 3 days passed. 3 days in which no one from town came to buy supplies from Marisol's ranch. 3 days in which the silence felt heavier than any words could have been. She woke on the 4th morning to find Dakota in her kitchen, attempting to prepare coffee despite his still healing ribs. "You should be resting," she said from the doorway. He turned, and the morning light through the window caught his face just right. "I've rested enough. Time to be useful." "You're already useful," Marisol replied, then felt heat rise to her cheeks at how the words sounded. "I mean, you don't need to prove anything. Maybe I need to prove it to myself." He poured coffee into 2 cups with careful movements. "You defended me, sacrificed your standing in the community. The least I can do is make breakfast." They sat across from each other at her small table, the domestic intimacy of the moment not lost on either of them. Dakota's hair was loose today, falling past his shoulders, and Marisol found herself wanting to know what it would feel like between her fingers. "Tell me about your ranch," he said, breaking the silence. How you built it. So she told him, about her father's debts, about working as a hand on other people's land until she'd saved enough to buy this plot, about the years of learning, failing, rebuilding, about nights so lonely she'd considered riding into town and accepting whatever marriage proposal might come, just to have another heartbeat in the house. But you didn't, Dakota observed. No, because I realized a lonely marriage would be worse than lonely independence. She looked down at her coffee. Though some nights, I wasn't sure I believed that. And now, the question hung between them, weighted with meaning. Marisol met his eyes. Now I think maybe I was waiting for something I didn't know existed. Dakota reached across the table, his hand covering hers. His skin was warm, calloused from a different kind of work than hers, but equally earned. In my culture, when we find something rare, we don't question it. We honor it. I'm not rare, Marisol said softly. I'm ordinary, old, used up. You're none of those things. His thumb traced slow circles on her palm, and she felt it like a current through her entire body. You're a woman who survived, who built something from nothing, who chose kindness over fear. These are the qualities my people value above all others. Your people aren't here. No, but I am. The air between them thickened. Marisol's breath came shorter. She should pull her hand away, should remember the decades between them, the impossibility of what her body was suggesting. But Dakota was looking at her the way she'd always imagined being looked at, not with pity or dismissal, but with desire that respected her rather than diminished her. Dakota, she whispered, this can't work. You know that. Why not? Because you're young. Because you'll want children someday. Because I can't give you what a wife should give. What should a wife give? He stood slowly, moving around the table until he stood beside her chair. My wife gave me 3 years of companionship, of shared purpose, of choosing each other every morning despite what the world demanded. Is that not enough? Marisol stood too, bringing them face to face, close enough that she could smell sage on his skin, could see the exact pattern of bronze in his dark eyes. People will say terrible things. About both of us. Let them. His hand lifted slowly, giving her time to pull away, and cupped her face with a gentleness that made her throat tight. I've lost too much to care what people say. I only care what feels true. And this, his thumb brushed her cheekbone. Feels true. Marisol closed her eyes, leaning into his touch despite every rational thought screaming caution. When had anyone touched her face like this? Like she was something precious rather than something to be pitied. The moment broke with the sound of hoofbeats, multiple horses approaching fast. Dakota dropped his hand immediately, moving to the window. His body went rigid. It's a rider from my village, he said quietly. My brother. Marisol felt her stomach drop. Of course. He had a life beyond this ranch, beyond her. She'd known that, but somehow in the past few days she'd let herself forget. Does he know you're here? She asked. He's been looking for me. I told you I left to find peace, but... Dakota turned to face her, and there was something heavy in his expression. My village wants me to return, to fulfill a promise I made before my wife died. What kind of promise? To lead them, to become what my father was. He moved closer, urgency in his voice now. But I don't want that life anymore. I don't want to return to grief and duty and expectation. For the first time since I lost my family, I want something different. I want... He didn't finish, but Marisol understood, because she wanted it too. Wanted this impossible thing that had bloomed between them in less than a week. This feeling that she'd been waiting 52 years without knowing what she was waiting for. Then tell him, she said. Tell him you're staying. If I do, there's no going back. My people will see it as abandonment, and your town already sees you as disgraced. His hands found hers, gripping tight. Are you sure you want to tie your life to mine? To make this permanent? Outside, the hoofbeats grew closer. Inside, Marisol felt the weight of every lonely year pressing against this one perfect, terrifying moment of possibility, a choice that would define whatever time she had left. I've spent my whole life being sure of nothing, she said. Maybe it's time I chose something uncertain. But before Dakota could respond, his brother was at the door, and the expression on the young warrior's face made it clear this conversation was far from over. The man who entered Marisol's home was younger than Dakota, perhaps 25. but carried himself with the authority of someone used to being obeyed. His eyes swept over the small kitchen, lingering on the 2 coffee cups on the table, before settling on his brother with a mixture of relief and anger. "Dakota." He spoke in their language, rapid and sharp. Dakota answered in kind, his voice level but firm. The exchange went back and forth, growing more heated, until finally the younger man switched to English, his gaze landing on Marisol. "You are the woman who sheltered my brother." It wasn't a question. "I am. My name is Marisol Crane. I am Chayton, Dakota's brother." He looked her up and down with an assessment that felt clinical rather than judgmental. "Our father is dying. He has asked for Dakota every day since the fever took him. Our people need him to return and accept his responsibility." Marisol felt something cold settle in her chest. She'd known this moment would come, but not so soon. Not when everything felt so unfinished. "I told you I wasn't going back," Dakota said in English, clearly for Marisol's benefit. "My life is no longer there. Your life is wherever our people need you." Chayton's voice hardened. "You made a promise to Father, to lead when he could no longer lead. That time has come. I made that promise when I was a different man, when I had a wife and child to build a future for." Dakota's hands clenched at his sides. "They're gone. That future is gone. I don't want that path anymore. What you want doesn't matter." Chayton stepped closer, and Marisol could see the family resemblance in the set of their jaws, the same determined fire in their eyes. 70 families depend on strong leadership, children who need to be taught, elders who need to be protected. You would abandon them for what? For this? His gesture encompassed the small kitchen, and by extension, Marisol herself. The dismissal in that word, "this," hit her harder than she expected. She was this, the thing keeping Dakota from his duty, the obstacle to his rightful place in the world. "She has a name," Dakota said, his voice dangerous now, "and she's worth more than you know. She's a woman past her years with no family, no standing." Chayton's words were matter-of-fact rather than cruel, which somehow made them worse. "In a few seasons she'll be even older. She can't give you children, can't give you the life you deserve. What future do you have here?" "The one I choose," Dakota replied. "Not the one chosen for me." Chayton studied his brother for a long moment, then turned to Marisol. "Has he told you about Sakyo?" Marisol felt Dakota go rigid beside her. "Chayton, don't. She should know what you're refusing to return to." Chayton's eyes remained on Marisol. "Sakyo is the daughter of our neighboring village's leader. She's 22, strong, fertile. She's been waiting 3 years for Dakota to finish his mourning and accept their betrothal." The room tilted slightly. Marisol gripped the back of the chair for support. "Betrothal? It was arranged before my wife died," Dakota said quickly. "I never agreed to it after she was gone. I told them I wouldn't honor it." "You told them you needed time," Chayton corrected. "They've given you that time. Now Father is dying, and your people need you to come home and fulfill your obligations. All of them." Marisol understood then, fully understood what Dakota staying would cost him. Not just his role as leader, but a young woman who'd been promised to him, a future of children and continuation of his line. Everything a man his age should want. "I think you should talk to your brother alone," she said quietly, moving toward the door. "Marisol, wait." Dakota reached for her, but she stepped back. "No, he's right. You have responsibilities that go far beyond me." She couldn't look at him, couldn't bear to see the conflict in his eyes. "You should go with him. That's not what I want. It doesn't matter what you want." She echoed Chayton's words, hating how they tasted. "It matters what's right. Those people need you. That girl is waiting for you. And She finally looked up, met his eyes. "I'm a 52-year-old woman who's been alone so long I forgot how to be anything else. I let myself believe in something impossible. That was my mistake, not yours." "It wasn't a mistake," Dakota said, his voice rough. "What I feel for you isn't a mistake. Maybe not, but it's not enough either." Marisol forced herself to move to the door, to open it. "Thank you for the coffee, and for making me feel even briefly like I mattered to someone. You do matter. Not enough to choose over your entire people." She looked at Chayton. "Take him home. His father is dying. That's more important than anything happening here." Chayton nodded slowly, something like respect flickering across his face. He turned to Dakota. "I'll wait outside. You have until the sun is directly overhead. Then we leave, with or without your agreement." When they were alone, Dakota crossed the room in 2 strides, his hands framing Marisol's face with a desperation that made her throat tight. Don't do this. Don't decide for me. I'm not deciding for you. I'm facing reality. She could feel tears threatening, but refused to let them fall. You have a duty to your people. I won't be the reason you abandon them. I've been called many things, Dakota, but I won't be called the woman who destroyed a good man's honor. My honor isn't more important than my happiness. Yes, it is. She pulled his hands away from her face, held them for just a moment before letting go. Go home. Be who you're meant to be. And forget about the desperate old woman who let herself imagine something beautiful. She left then, walking out of her own house because she couldn't bear to watch him struggle with the choice she'd already made for both of them. Behind the barn, finally alone, Marisol let herself break. When Marisol emerged from behind the barn an hour later, both horses were gone. The kitchen was empty. The coffee cups still sat on the table. Cold now, a reminder of what had almost been. She poured them out and washed them carefully, as if the act of cleaning could scrub away the ache in her chest. She told herself this was better. Cleaner. He'd gone back to his people where he belonged, and she would return to her solitary existence. It had been enough before. It would be enough again. She almost believed it. 5 days passed. 5 days in which Marisol threw herself into work, repairing fences that didn't need repair, organizing supplies that were already organized. Anything to keep her hands busy and her mind from wandering to dark eyes and gentle touches. But at night, in the silence, she couldn't escape the hollowness that had taken up residence in her chest. On the 6th day, she ran out of flour and sugar, essentials she couldn't do without, which meant a trip to town. The thought of facing Cordelia and the others made her stomach turn, but she had no choice. The ride into town felt longer than usual. When she arrived, the street seemed unnaturally quiet. People saw her coming and disappeared into shops or crossed to the other side of the street. She tied her horse outside the general store and walked in, spine straight, despite the weight of stairs following her. Inside, Vernon's wife Clara stood behind the counter, her expression uncomfortable. Marisol, I need flour and sugar, Marisol said simply, and coffee if you have it. I'm not sure we can serve you. Clara wouldn't meet her eyes. Why not? My money is as good as anyone's. It's not about money. It's about... Clara trailed off, looking toward the back of the store where voices murmured. Cordelia says you've been consorting with that savage, says you've shamed yourself and the whole town. She's convinced people that trading with you is the same as condoning your behavior. My behavior. Marisol let out a bitter laugh. I helped an injured man. That's all. That's not what people are saying. Clara lowered her voice. They're saying you tried to take him as a husband, that you threw yourself at a man half your age out of desperation, that you're a cautionary tale about what happens when women forget their place. Each word landed like a stone. Marisol felt them accumulating, building a wall around her that she'd never be able to climb. He's gone. He went back to his people. Are you satisfied? It doesn't matter now. The damage is done. Clara finally looked up, and there was something like pity in her eyes. I'm sorry, Marisol, but I can't serve you. None of the merchants will. Cordelia has made sure of that. Marisol stood there, absorbing the reality of her situation. Cast out. Made invisible in a new, more vicious way. Not ignored, but actively rejected. And for what? For a week of feeling seen. For a handful of tender moments that had given her a glimpse of what life could have been. She turned to leave and nearly collided with Sarah Mitchell, the town doctor's wife. But Sarah didn't step aside. Instead, she caught Marisol's arm. Wait, Sarah said quietly. She glanced around, then led Marisol to the far corner of the store. What Cordelia is doing to you isn't right. It doesn't matter. It's done. It matters because she's doing it out of jealousy, not righteousness. Sarah's grip tightened. You don't know, do you? About Cordelia's past? Marisol shook her head. 25 years ago, before she married Vernon's son, Cordelia fell in love with a traveling trader, a man from the East with no roots here. Her family forbade it, said he was beneath her, that she needed to marry someone established. So she did. She married into the Vance family, lived the proper life, had proper children. Sarah's voice dropped even lower, but she never stopped wondering what would have happened if she'd been brave enough to choose differently. And seeing you do what she couldn't, it's destroying her. The revelation settled over Marisol like a heavy blanket. Cordelia's viciousness wasn't about morality. It was about regret given a voice. About a woman punishing someone else for having the courage she'd lacked. "Why are you telling me this?" Marisol asked. "Because you did something brave. You chose what you wanted instead of what was expected. And even though it didn't work out, even though you lost him, at least you tried." Sarah squeezed her arm once more before letting go. "That's more than most of us can say, including Cordelia." Marisol left the store empty-handed but with something heavier than supplies weighing on her. She'd sent Dakota away to protect his honor, to spare him from being the man who abandoned his people for a woman past her prime. But in doing so, had she made the same mistake Cordelia had? Had she chosen safety and propriety over the one chance she'd ever have at genuine connection? The ride home felt even longer. The sun was setting by the time she reached her property, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. She dismounted slowly, her body heavy with exhaustion and regret. The house loomed before her, emptier than it had ever been. She was putting her horse in the corral when she heard it. Hoofbeats. A single rider approaching fast from the direction of town. Marisol's heart leaped despite her attempt to control it. But it wouldn't be him. Couldn't be him. He was days away by now, back with his people where he belonged. The rider emerged from the fading light, and Marisol's breath caught. Long, dark hair. Familiar posture. Dakota pulled his horse to a stop at the edge of her property, dismounted, and stood there, chest heaving as if he'd been riding hard. "I made it 2 days," he said, his voice carrying across the distance between them. 2 days before I realized I was riding toward the wrong home. Marisol couldn't move, couldn't speak, could only stare at this man who'd come back when everything logical said he shouldn't have. "My father died yesterday," Dakota continued, walking slowly toward her. Chayton brought the news. "I sat with my people during the morning rites. I listened to them talk about duty and responsibility and carrying on my father's legacy." He stopped a few feet away, "And all I could think about was you. About coffee at sunrise. About the way you look at me like I'm worth something beyond what I can provide." Dakota. His name was barely a whisper. "Chayton will lead our people. He's always been better suited for it anyway. Sakyo will find someone who wants the life she offers." He took another step closer. "But I couldn't find anyone else who makes me feel the way you do, and I'm done pretending that duty matters more than being alive. Your people will survive without me, but I don't think I'll survive without you." He reached for her hands, and she let him take them. "I'm not asking you to give me anything, Marisol. I'm not asking for children or a conventional life or anything you can't offer. I'm just asking if you'll let me stay. Let me choose you the way no one else has." Behind him, the sun dipped below the horizon, throwing everything into shadow. And in that shadow, Marisol made the first truly selfish choice of her entire life. Marisol didn't speak. She couldn't. Instead, she closed the distance between them and did something she hadn't done in over 50 years. She reached up, pulled Dakota's face down to hers, and kissed him. Not tentatively. Not with the hesitation of a woman who'd been taught her entire life that she didn't deserve this, but with the hunger of someone who'd finally stopped apologizing for wanting something real. When they broke apart, Dakota's forehead rested against hers, both of them breathing hard. "Is that a yes?" he asked, and she could hear the smile in his voice. "It's a yes," she whispered, "but you need to understand what you're choosing. The town has turned against me. No one will trade with me. They've made me invisible again, but in a worse way. If you stay, you'll face that too. Then we'll face it together." He pulled back just enough to look into her eyes. "I've spent 3 years running from grief. I'm tired of running. I want to stay. With you. Here." The next morning, they rode into town together. Not hiding, not ashamed. Dakota sat straight in his saddle beside her, his presence a statement that couldn't be ignored. People stopped on the street to stare. Whispers followed them like wind through grass. But Marisol kept her eyes forward, one hand resting on her saddle horn, the other occasionally brushing against Dakota's as their horses walked side by side. They stopped in front of the general store. Clara stood in the doorway, her expression uncertain. Behind her, other townspeople gathered, drawn by the spectacle. "I need supplies," Marisol said clearly, her voice carrying. "Flour, sugar, coffee, and salt. I can pay fair price." "Marisol, I told you," Clara began, but Cordelia pushed forward from the crowd. "You have some nerve showing your face here," Cordelia said, her voice sharp. "And bringing him with you? Are you trying to prove how shameless you've become?" "I'm not trying to prove anything." Marisol dismounted slowly, Dakota doing the same beside her. I'm living my life. The same right you have. You're making a mockery of decency, Cordelia countered. A woman your age with a man barely past his youth. It's indecent. Desperate. You're right, Marisol said, and the admission made Cordelia pause. I am desperate. Desperate to finally feel something after decades of numbness. Desperate to be seen as more than a cautionary tale. Desperate enough to stop caring what people like you think of me. She turned to face the gathered crowd and found her voice stronger than it had ever been. I spent 52 years doing everything right. Being quiet, invisible, acceptable. And what did it get me? Nothing but loneliness and the pity of people who never once tried to know me. So yes, I'm choosing this. I'm choosing him. I'm choosing to be happy for whatever time I have left, even if it means you all despise me. The silence that followed was heavy. Then Sarah Mitchell stepped forward from the crowd. I don't despise you, she said quietly. I think you're braver than any of us. Sarah, Cordelia hissed. But Sarah ignored her. My husband and I will trade with you, Sarah continued. And I imagine others will too, once they remember that judging people is easier than facing their own cowardice. A few people in the crowd shifted uncomfortably. One by one, some began to disperse, the spectacle losing its appeal. Cordelia stood frozen, her face pale with impotent rage. Finally, she turned and stalked away, her power over the moment broken. Clara looked from the retreating figure of Cordelia to Marisol, then sighed. I'll get your supplies. 3 months later, Marisol stood in her kitchen preparing breakfast while Dakota checked the fences. The town hadn't fully forgiven her transgression against their expectations, but enough people had quietly resumed trading with her that the ranch remained viable. Some even nodded to her on the street now, though few spoke directly. She'd learned she didn't need their approval. She had something better, something real. Dakota came through the door, bringing the smell of morning air and sage with him. He crossed to her, wrapped his arms around her waist from behind, his chin resting on her shoulder. The north fence needs repair, he said. We should ride out this afternoon. We, Marisol repeated, savoring the word. After a lifetime of I, she finally had we. You're smiling, Dakota observed, pressing a kiss to her temple. I'm happy, she replied, turning in his arms to face him. I didn't think that was possible anymore. Everything is possible, he said, when you stop letting other people decide what you deserve. Marisol looked at this man who'd chosen her when logic said he shouldn't, who saw her age as wisdom rather than decay, who touched her like she was precious rather than pitiful. She'd been told her whole life she was too old for love, too weathered for tenderness, too unmarried to matter. They'd all been wrong. Outside, the morning sun climbed higher, painting the grasslands gold. Inside, two people who'd both lost their way found something neither expected. Not perfection, not a fairy tale ending, just the simple, radical act of choosing each other despite what the world demanded. And for the first time in 52 years, Marisol Crane understood that she'd never been too old for anything. She'd just been waiting for someone brave enough to see past the number and find the woman underneath. If you love this story of courage and unexpected love in the Wild West, click the video on your screen to discover another tale from the frontier where one choice changes everything. These stories of resilience and transformation will keep you captivated. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss our next Western tale. Hit that button now, and let's continue this journey together.